Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be continuing our study of Solomon in our ongoing series of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. Last time we looked at 1 Kings chapters 1 through 4 as we saw Solomon's succession to the throne, and then we viewed Solomon's wisdom and his wealth. Now we come to chapters 5 through 8 as Solomon builds the temple. Now that part can be expanded. In chapter 5 we see the preparations for the building of the temple. In chapter 6 the actual construction is ensued. And then in chapter 7 we have a description of the building of Solomon's own house. When we get to verse 13 we switch over to the ornamentation of the temple. And then finally in chapter 8 we have the temple is completed and Solomon gives a prayer of dedication and the Lord moves into the building. Now, prior to this we have the tabernacle. And the tabernacle had been described in several ways. First of all, the Hebrew word for tabernacle is mishkan. It comes from the word shakan, to dwell. So it was the place of dwelling. Who dwelt there? This was the place where the Lord dwelled. The sides were portable. It was made of a framework overlaid with gold. And there was a curtain over the structure. Now we're going to see in a moment, that's sort of a familiar idea. When they looked into Tutankhamun's tomb, they found this sort of flimsy structure of portable sticks that were overlaid with gold, and then a curtain over it. In other words, a tabernacle that was over the sarcophagus of King Tutankhamun. And the same description goes for the tabernacle. It's also called the tent of meeting because that's where the Lord would meet with first with Moses and later with the Israelites. It's also called the tent of testimony because the Ark of Testimony was there. And it's also called the sanctuary, the holy place. Now, those designations, tabernacle and tent of meeting and tent of testimony and sanctuary, are used in the New Testament to describe Jesus. In John chapter 1 verse 14, the Word becomes flesh and dwelt among us. That's a description of what Jesus was. He's the one who became flesh, dwelt among us. He's the dwelling place of God. He is our provision for meeting God. He is the one. No one has seen God at any time, but Jesus has explained him to us. He is also the tent of testimony. The tabernacle it bore testimony to the saving work of Jesus. And finally, it is the sanctuary. We come through the blood of Jesus to the holy place. We become holy through him. So that Jesus fulfilled the tabernacle, but notice not only does Jesus fulfill the tabernacle, the church, we also fulfill that symbolism because we have become the dwelling place of the Holy Spirit, the tabernacle. And likewise, our fellowship is in Christ so that we become the tent of meeting. And also we are to be a testimony. We are to be witnesses of him. Acts chapter 1 verse 8 was a command given to the apostles, but it also applies to us. You are to go and be witnesses of Jesus and of the resurrected Christ, the living Christ. We are to point to him just like the tabernacle pointed to him. And finally, we are called to be holy. We are the holy place. Because he has made us holy, he says, now be holy. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 5, we read of the preparations for the building of the temple. The temple will now replace the tabernacle. King Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had appointed him king in place of his father, for Hiram had always been a friend of David. And Tyre is going to help, King Hiram is going to help Solomon in his construction of a tabernacle. Hiram sent word to Solomon saying, I've heard the message which you have sent me. I will do what you desire concerning the cedar and the cypress timber. All the good wood grows up in what we call Lebanon today, surrounding the city of Tyre. Verse 9, my servants will bring them down from Lebanon. And how are they going to bring them? Of course, Tyre is an ocean-going city, so they're going to bring them by sea. I will make them into rafts and go by sea to the place where you direct me, and I will have them broken up there, and you shall carry them away. then you shall accomplish my desire by giving food to my household. So it's a mutual arrangement where Hiram is supplying Solomon with cedar wood for the building of the temple, and Solomon is going to be supplying Hiram with food for the household. So we have in Josephus in his Antiquities tells us that the copies of these epistles, these letters that are written between Solomon and the king of Tyre, remain at this day. Now, Josephus is speaking in the 1st century AD. He says they remain at this day and are preserved not only in our books, but also among the Tyrians, also, inasmuch that if any would know about the certainty about them, he may desire of the keepers of the public records of Tyre to show him them, and he will find what is there set down to agree with what we have said. That there was a independent testimony to the truth of this correspondence that goes back and forth between Tyre and Solomon. Well, chapter 6 verse 1 says, it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is in the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So I'm using Thiel's dates here. I won't always be consistent, but they're pretty close, if not exactly right. Thiel puts the Exodus at 1447. I think he's within 10 years or so of being on target. And that would put the beginning of Solomon's reign at 971 BC, and then the 4th year of Solomon's would then be 967. And just if I add the rest of that in, when we get to 931 BC, we're going to have Solomon's death. So again, those are Thiel's dates. Now remember, when we have the 480th year, I think he's speaking literally, and yet not with rigid literalism. In other words, this number might be rounded off just a bit. If we're coming to the nearest 10, it might be 479 or 481. Yeah, that's allowed. I don't think what is happening, what's been suggested by some scholars, is that this is just speaking of multiples of 12 generations. I don't think that's what's taking place here. I think it's around 480 years, this period of time, and that's why I accept this early dating of the Exodus, Thiel's dates, or anything that comes close to that. Well, Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. Now, Moriah had been mentioned way back in the book of Genesis, where Isaac had been taken by his father Abraham to the land of Moriah, onto a mountain, there to be sacrificed. And God had stopped the sacrifice at the last minute. But now we have the temple being built on Mount Moriah. If it's a mountain called Moriah, perhaps it's also in the land of Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. There's a story that had taken place at the end of 2 Samuel, where David had a great plague had taken place in the land of Israel, and it was partly because of David's own sin. He had been trying to number the people, and David had interceded, and the plague had stopped at this place on Mount Moriah, where a sacrifice had been made, and now on the same spot they are going to build the temple at that place that David had prepared on the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And David had purchased it, and now it had been set aside for the temple. The temple itself will be constructed with a main hall, that is a holy place, and then what's called here in our photograph the shrine, or the Holy of Holies, which will be not only the innermost part of the temple, but I would suggest also the highest part of the temple. After all, the temple is being built on a mountain. And so the Holy of Holies will be placed on the mountain peak, the very highest part of that temple. The dimensions of the temple, when compared to the tabernacle, it can be seen that the temple is exactly the same dimensions, except all those dimensions are doubled. So if the tabernacle was 30 cubits in length, the temple, you'll double that, the temple will be 60 cubits. Remember, a cubit, we said roughly about 18 inches, so that would make the tabernacle 45 feet long, and the temple 90 feet long. That's not an incredibly large building, because it's not a building for people to be in. It's a building only for the presence of the Lord. Notice I have the entire structure, but also I've given you the dimensions of the Holy of Holies, where it was the tabernacle was 10 cubits by 10 cubits by 10 cubits, the temple 20 by 20 by 20 cubits, which if we put that in feet, it's 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet, a perfect cube. So that the tabernacle is now going to be replaced by the temple, a permanent dwelling twice as big, with the uppermost room being the Holy of Holies, on the very pinnacle of the mountaintop. It would have within it lampstands, a whole series of them, and tables, not just one table, but a series of tables of bread. And then inside would be the Holy of Holies with the Ark of the Covenant and statues of 2 cherubim. If you go to Israel today, to the Temple Mount today, on the top of that mountain is a structure known as the Dome of the Rock. Notice it's a little higher than the surrounding top of the mountain. It's the very highest spot. And if you are allowed, and I've been to the Temple Mount, but I've never been allowed inside because I'm not Muslim. But if one was to be allowed to go inside the Dome of the Rock, the reason it's called the Dome of the Rock is because inside, and this is a camera angle, compliments of National Geographic looking down at the rock, the Dome of the Rock is built around a raised rock platform. Notice the dimensions. Look very much, except there's been some erosion, look very much like the dimensions that we would expect to see of the Holy of Holies. I think the rock was the bedrock of the Holy of Holies. So that we had the temple, and remember, not anyone would go into the temple, only the priests, and only the high priest going into the innermost part. Outside you would have the great altar, and notice the portable altar is now replaced by a huge altar, a great altar. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this house which you are building, if you will walk in my statutes and execute my ordinances and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will carry out my word with you, which I spoke to David your father, and I will dwell among the sons of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. So we have in chapter 6 the date of the beginning of the work, and then a description of the outer structure of the temple. We have what we just read, some of the covenant conditions. But then we have the inner structure of the temple described. And then finally we have the date of the completion of the work that's given. It's this entire description is given in a chiastic format, a paralleled format. The Holy of Holies. Notice we said that the Holy of Holies had the dimensions of an exact cube. It signified the presence of God. It was overlaid with pure gold. That's in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 20. And it was filled, when God comes into the building after there's been a prayer of dedication, it was filled with the glory of God. Now, the New Jerusalem likewise signifies the bride, the wife of the Lamb, the presence of God. It is made of pure gold, and it is illumined by the glory of God. Do you remember the dimensions, of the Holy of Holies? It was a perfect cube where its length, its width, and its height were all identical. And likewise, the New Jerusalem, its width and its length and its height are all of an identical measurement. Now, it's much bigger. The New American Standard has probably done us a little bit of a disservice. They're accurate. In Revelation we read that the New Jerusalem was measured and it was so many hundreds of miles, and that's accurate, but it misses the symbolism. that it was 12,000 stadia. By 12,000 stadia, by 12,000, in other words, its length and its width and its height, each 12,000. That's a representative, a symbolic number. 12,000. Sounds much like 12,000 plus 12,000 plus 12,000. Remember how we have the 144,000 representing God's people. Here it is again. Well, the inner sanctuary, in the inner sanctuary, Solomon made 2 cherubim, these statues. I'm not sure what they look like. We have an artist's imagination. These 2 strong ones, that's what the word cherubim means, and they're plurals because there's 2 of them, so we don't say cherubs, cherubim, of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. So they are virtually filling the inner part of the Holy of Holies. Now the cherubim in the tabernacle had been made of solid gold. These cherubim in the temple are made of olive wood. They are overlaid with gold because they're much bigger. The cherubim in the tabernacle, they're placed on the top of the Ark of the Covenant. They're smaller in size. Those cherubim are still there because the Ark of the Covenant is still there. But these cherubim stand on either side of the Ark of the Covenant with their wings over the Ark. Their wings filling the entire area. The cherubim in the tabernacle faced one another as they looked toward the mercy seat, with their wings overshadowing the mercy seat. The cherubim in the temple, these ones that are made of olive wood, they seem to be facing outward as they look out toward the worshipers. Can't say that for sure, but that seems to be the description here. Now, we're told that the entrance of the inner sanctuary, for that entrance, Solomon made doors of olive wood, the lintel, and the 5-sided doorposts. So he made 2 doors of olive wood, and he carved on them carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and overlaid them with gold, and he spread the gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. So we have doors with the images of cherubim, these winged creatures, upon the doors. What I'm showing you here is a picture of one of the relics that was found in Tutankhamun's tomb. On that tomb there is engraved on this box, overlaid with gold, and on the gold, 2 winged creatures. Can I be so bold as to call them strong ones? Cherubim. Of course, they have Egyptian features. Now, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 37. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. In the month of Ziv, in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished throughout all its parts and according to all its plans. So he was 7 years in building it. He fashioned the 2 pillars of bronze. 18 cubits was the height of one pillar, and a line of 12 cubits measured the circumference of both. So 2 great bronze pillars, both very wide and very high. Verse 16, he also made 2 capitals of molten bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. The height of the one capital was 5 cubits. The height of the other capital was 5 cubits. Now, what are these pillars all about? It has been suggested that these are representative. You see, the pillars are going to have at the top of their crest, on the capitals, they have pomegranates all around them. Pomegranates represent fruitfulness. So you have these 2 pillars up against the temple, which represents the place where God is. In other words, remember how heaven is his throne and earth is his footstool. So here is the presence of God on earth. Yeah, I could describe maybe the temple as in one, and I'm trying to be holy here, but the footstool of the Lord. And here's these bronze pillars, perhaps representing, not that it's an image of God, you can't do that, but representing the legs of God. And I say that because remember in Revelation chapter 1 where John has a vision of the risen Jesus. And his hair is white and his eyes are flashing and out of his mouth comes a sharp sword. But then we're told of his legs of bronze. The same description as the pillars here, that could be said to represent the legs of God as he sits upon his throne. pillars of bronze. They are given names. There is Jachin, which means he shall establish, and there is Boaz, strength, and as we noted, pomegranates at the crest, symbolizing fertility. Now, chapter 6, verse 23 says, he made the sea of cast metal. That is replacing the laver of water, which was before the tabernacle. Now there is a much greater laver of water, but it's not called a laver of water, it is called the sea. And it is 10 cubits from brim to brim, circular in form. Its height was 5 cubits, that's quite high. 30 cubits in circumference. A sea, now it's not a rough, stormy sea, it's a smooth sea. Can I say it like this? A sea as if of crystal. Remember how in Revelation chapter 4, John has a vision of heaven, and he sees the throne of God before a crystal sea. That's temple language. It's calling to mind the temple and picturing the throne of God as being at a temple. As you went into the temple, Solomon made all the furniture which was in the house of the Lord. There was a golden altar, the altar of incense, where twice a day, a priest would go in the morning and in the evening, and would offer incense upon this altar. And it would, when you put incense and fire, you mix them together, and there's a sweet-smelling smoke. And it would represent the prayers of God's people going up. And there was also a golden table on which was the bread of the presence, 12 loaves of bread, 12 tribes of Israel, representing the presence, yes, of the Lord, but of his people. And there's also the lampstands, 5 on the right side and 5 on the left in front of the inner sanctuary of pure gold. But notice the lampstands. And this isn't new to Solomon. This was described back in the book of Exodus as well. They have flowers and the lamps and the tongs of gold, and the cups and the snuffers and the bowls and the spoons and the fire pans of pure gold, and the hinges both for the doors of the inner house, the most holy, and for the doors of the house, that is, of the nave of gold. The lampstands are described as stylized trees, where they have branches and they have flowers and they have bulbs. A tree of light, but also a tree of life. That sounds familiar, and it should. It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And so the temple was completed, the place where they would come before the Lord, but into the Holy of Holies, remember, only the high priest is going to be allowed, and then only once a year. Now we have the dedication of the temple in 1 Kings chapter 8. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' households of the sons of Israel, to King Solomon in Jerusalem to bring up the Ark of the Covenant. It had already been brought in Jerusalem. Now it is going to be brought up from the city of David into the temple. The throne of God will enter the house of God. And all the men of Israel assembled themselves to King Solomon at the feast in the month Ethanim, which is the 7th month. And then the priests brought the ark. They leave the cart behind. The priests brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place, into the inner sanctuary of the house, to the most holy place, under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim made a covering over the ark and its poles from above. But the poles were so long that the ends of the poles could be seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen outside. And the writer of 1 Kings says, and they are there to this day. Which means that he's writing this part at least, is being written before the destruction of Jerusalem, before the Jews had been taken into captivity. Because after that, the ark is going to be lost. Now we're told there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone which Moses had put there at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the sons of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. I'm not sure what had happened to the other things, but only the 2 tablets of stone remain. And it happened that when the priests came from the holy place, after they had deposited the Ark of the Covenant where it belonged, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. You see what happened? God entered the building. The presence of the Lord, the glory cloud, enters the building. And Solomon now gives both a blessing in verses 12 through 21, and then a prayer in verses 22 through 61. In verse 27, that's part of the prayer, Solomon asks, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built?" He says, look, we built a house for God. God can't really fit in there. God's much bigger than that. But the presence of God can still be made manifest there inside the temple. He goes on to say, "Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his supplication, O Lord my God, to listen to the cry and to the prayer which your servant prays before you today, that your eyes may be open toward this house night and day, toward the place of which you have said, my name shall be there, to listen to the prayer which your servant shall pray toward this place." Lord, let this temple be a place of answered prayer. Let it be a place where you see things that are going on here. In his prayer, Solomon makes 7 requests. The first of these is that God would judge any who wrongfully makes an oath before the altar of the Lord. The second request is that God would forgive repentant people when they have been defeated. The third request is that God would bring rain when a drought has come because of sin. The fourth request is that God would answer prayers in the face of famine and plagues. The fifth request, that God would hear their prayers when they go out to battle against an enemy. The sixth request, that God would even hear the prayers of those who happen to be in a foreign land and are not there at the temple to make their request known. And finally, the seventh request, and by this time this should start looking familiar to you, the seventh request is that God would hear the prayers of his people while they are in captivity. Now, each of those instances, as we look at that collection of those requests, they remind us of something. What is taking place is that each of these requests is patterned after the warnings that are given in Leviticus chapter 26, where God promises a number of cycles, 5 in particular, 5 cycles of discipline upon Israel if they reject his word. And the worst was that you'll be finally taken out of the land. And now Solomon prays, notice that 7th request, even if they're taken out of the land and taken into captivity, Lord, will you hear their request? Well, Solomon now we're told about his dealings with God and the nations. We see his wise dealings in chapter 9, his wise dealings with the Lord, his dealings with Hiram, the king of Tyre, his dealings with the Pharaoh of Egypt, his dealings with the pagan inhabitants of those dominions that he has exercised sovereignty. And finally, we see him with the Queen of Sheba, this queen far to the south, who travels to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Notice the first of those was with God, and all the others are his wise dealings with people, men as, or in the case may be, women. But there are problems on the horizon. First of all, the Lord warns Solomon of the consequences of breaking the terms of the covenant. This isn't just a promise. This isn't just a deal. God has entered into a covenant, and there's consequences of breaking that covenant. And Hiram, likewise, he expresses some dissatisfaction in his dealings with Solomon and his gift of certain border cities. And Solomon has given some other cities back to Hiram. And Solomon says, well, the cities I gave you were worth a lot. The cities you gave me, they weren't worth much. The Israelites were told, do not complete the purging of the Canaanites from the land. Chapter 9, verse 1, Now it came about when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house, and all that Solomon desired to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And God promises him, look, if you will walk before me as your father David walked, that was integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I've commanded, keeping my statutes and my ordinances. If you do all those things, here's the if-then clause, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever. If, on the other hand, you or your son shall turn away from following me, shall not keep my commandments and my statutes, shall go and serve other gods and worship them, if you do that, those sorts of things, then I will cut off Israel. Israel will be a proverb and a byword of bad things. This house will be ruined, and everyone will be astonished. Well, it comes about at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the two houses of the Lord and the king's house, that Hiram, king of Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress, timber and gold according to all his desire. Here we see this exchange of cities. Then King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. And Hiram comes out from Tyre to see the cities that Solomon had given him, and they did not please him. And he said, what are these cities that you've given me, my brother? So they are called the land of Kabul today. That is that's Phoenician for the worthless place to this day. Hebrew has a different word, the Havel, seems to mean pledged. You know, these are things are promised, and the Phoenicians say, well, they were promised, but they're worthless. So there's a little play on words. Next, we want to look at Solomon's building programs in chapter 9, verses 15 through 28. He fortifies cities, and what I've put here are the diagrams of what the city gates would look like, both at Gezer, at Hatzor, but especially at Megiddo. The site at Megiddo is just phenomenal to see. You can also see the sort of thing at Dan, but I've not included that here because Solomon doesn't build the gates at Dan. But at Megiddo and at Gezer and at Hatzor, we have a gate assembly where if an enemy breaks through the gate, notice there are these little alcoves on either side where there's going to be warriors there that can attack from either end. In time of peace, it's going to be a nice, cool, breezy place, and it will be where the shopping market meets. But in time of war, you have these extensive fortifications. Here's a picture of a reconstruction. The reconstruction is both of Megiddo, and it's actually at Megiddo. You have to go there to see the reconstruction. And it shows what this gate assembly would have looked like. Great, massive fortifications protecting the entry into the city. Here's how much of that fortification remains today. It was much higher in that day and had more elaborate finishings on it, but you can still go today and stand in the gates at Megiddo. Another picture of the gate assembly and the walls, what's left of them anyway, of the walls at Megiddo. Now, in 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 24, we read that as soon as Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her house, which Solomon had built for her, then he built the Milo. And 3 times a year, in a year, Solomon offered burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar, which he built to the Lord, burning incense with him on the altar, which was before the Lord. So he finished the house. Notice we have both in those 2 verses a hint of what was wrong with Solomon's reign. That is, he had married the wrong gal. He had married the Pharaoh's daughter. And we also have a hint of what's right with Solomon's reign, that he was offering peace offerings, burnt offerings and peace offerings to the Lord. However, we go on to read about the Pharaoh's daughter sacrificing at high places, and that's in 1 Kings chapter 3. We have the first appearance of the Lord, as he first appeared to Solomon. That was in chapter 3, verses 4 through 15. We've seen his wisdom at work, his building projects. That took us through from chapter 3 all the way to chapter 8. Then we have that second appearance of the Lord to Solomon in chapter 9. And now we come to full circle. This was suggested by one of my professors. I didn't have him for Old Testament, but I had him as a professor at RTS, Dr. Richard Pratt. He points out that I come full circle to see again Pharaoh's daughter in chapter 9, verse 24. And again, they're sacrificing, this time at the temple, not in high places. But notice how the entire Solomonic account both begins and ends with Pharaoh's daughter. Well, that's not the complete end. That's just the end of this section. In chapter 9, verse 26, we read that King Solomon also built a fleet of ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Eloth. Now, that city is still called Elat today, hasn't changed the name in 3,000 years. Near Eloth, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. I want to be careful here because the Hebrew text actually calls it the Yam Suf, the Reed Sea. Remember we talked about that back when we were looking at the Exodus. It's still called here the Reed Sea, but we've translated it the Red Sea because that's what we call it today. And notice this was in the land of Edom, even though Solomon was building a city and a harbor and ports there and ships. He has sovereignty over Edom, but it is still its own country. So we have this place called Ezion-Geber. Geber is the word for strong, literally the strong backbone. It's interesting that the modern name Aqaba means back. That's Arabic for the word back. And so even there the name has continued, at least its meaning has continued even to modern times. Well, Hiram sent his servants with the fleet because the Jews were not that good at sailors. So instead we have Phoenician sailors who knew the sea along with the servants of Solomon. And they went to Ophir. We're not sure exactly where that is. Might be another name for India. And they took 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. Now, when the queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with difficult questions. Sheba seems to be a reference to that area south of Arabia, all the way down to the Indian Ocean. She's coming from a great distance away to test Solomon. We come to Solomon's downfall in 1 Kings chapter 11. Verse 1 says, Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, You shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. And sure enough, that's going to happen because Solomon held fast to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, didn't happen while he was young necessarily, but when he was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. And so, because his heart is not wholly devoted, the Lord sends a prophet to prophesy and to make a change, to bring a prophecy of judgment. In verse 29, it came about at that time when Jeroboam had been formerly the chief taskmaster, the head of all the construction projects under Solomon, when when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him on the road. Now Ahijah had clothed himself with a new cloak, and both of them were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new cloak which was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. He said to Jeroboam, Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. But he will have 1 tribe for the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen from all the tribes of Israel. Do you see the symbolism here? He takes a new cloak. When was the last time we read about a cloak being torn? It was in the days of Saul and Samuel, when Saul had torn the cloak of Samuel, and Samuel said, Because of that, the kingdom will be torn from your grasp. Now a cloak is taken and torn into 12 pieces. 10 are given to Jeroboam. You're going to get the 10 tribes in the north. I'm going to give. Now you say, wait a minute. There's an uneven tearing. He's going to get 1 tribe, but really it's going to be sort of a tribe and a half or 2, because it will be Judah, but also sort of the tribe of Benjamin, at least part of that, and also the tribe of Levi. The Levites are still going to have their inheritance in both north and south, but they'll still be involved in worship in Jerusalem. But still, technically, he'll only have 1 tribe for the sake of David. Because why is this happening? Why is this happening? Because they have forsaken me and have worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddesses of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of the sons of Ammon, and they have not walked in my ways, according to what is right in my sight, and observing my statutes and my ordinance, as his father David did. Because Solomon had sinned, the kingdom will be torn apart. His descendants will only be allowed to rule over the southern kingdom, and from now on we will speak about the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel.